I've been called a frustrated woman, I've been called an unmarried woman, I've been called a devilish woman, I've been called all kinds of things, attacked personally, frustrated because I can't get a man, and that's why I'm doing all of this.
Feminists are called all sorts of things, including angry, but I don't know why that would be an insult. When I was younger, it was insulting to me, but the more I think about it, of course I'm angry. Why wouldn't I be angry, right? Why shouldn't I have as much outrage or even more about the state of the world? I think only if you're not paying attention or only if it doesn't affect you directly can you not be angry.
I think the backlash is a result of our success, because now people are seeing us fighting back as a collective. When you are at one, people don't fight back. But now we are a movement. We are a movement of feminists.
A movement means working together. Men don't like what, unless it's a Rotary Club or what. Unless it's a club. There's no, yes, a men's movement, no. But women, because of being a minority and being tradition has left them behind, they had to move together in order to be strong. I think that's where the word movement comes from.
Women's struggle for equal rights is centuries old. But 1848 marked a watershed moment for women's rights with the Seneca Falls Convention, where women activists publicly petitioned for their civil, social, political, and religious rights. In 1893, New Zealand sent a message to other activists across the world that equal voting rights were achievable through advocacy. Entering the 20th century, women around the world are mobilizing in ever greater numbers to campaign for gender equality, just as women's role in the labor force is rapidly evolving by opening up options beyond caretaking roles. In 1945, the United Nations is formed in response to the destructive toll of 2 world wars, and Eleanor Roosevelt oversees the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For all the world to hear, she and other advocates underline the place of women's rights within. This sets a foundation for women's rights norms and standards at the international level. In the subsequent decades, just as women are taking historic leadership positions in government, women activists at the grassroots level dovetail with the worldwide momentum by becoming powerful symbols of feminist resistance and social change. This momentum reaches a climax in 1995 when the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action presents a visionary global agenda for women and girls' rights. But in spite of all the progress, as we enter the 21st century, patriarchal stigmas persist and exemplary leaders arise to resist them. With the rise of the digital age, social media emerges as a crucial tool to galvanize populations in the fight against injustice. A single woman's voice is now louder than ever.
My birth, that my father was Katikiro Buganda, did not have anything to do with my believing in the opportunity and advantage of my education. So I considered, as I was being brought up, I didn't consider, at that age, I never considered that I was going to fight for women's rights, to fight for disadvantage. I was just in the process, I was only in the process of learning and growing up and absorbing all the education I was getting. I got the advantage, what I call an advantage, more than just my birth. Because our father didn't show us that his office was a status. His office was a service to the country. His office was a challenge to the country to serve the country and fulfill what his predecessor, Katikkiro Sapulokagwa, had done, to continue with that work. Because he learned from him what it meant to serve Buganda as Katikkiro. So that is separate. And as we grew up, he didn't show us that his work, his office was status. His office was duty, was service to serve the country, was a challenge to serve the country. Now, you're asking about what made me fight for the women. That came much later in my life, much later, in the 70s, after I had completed my secondary education, after I had completed, got married, after I had completed 3 years of further education in Britain. And when I came back, then I was absorbed. I found this struggle and of emancipation of women, and I was courted into the movement by the senior women who were above me. They mentored me, they called me into it. I seemed to like it, and the more I stayed with the women's movement, originally the Uganda Council of Women and the Status of Women Subcommittee, and I was given the opportunity, or rather the duty of being secretary to the Status of Women Subcommittee. The more I was in the organization, the more I felt the need to be identified with the needs of the women.
I would like to probably start my story from when I was a young woman, working with my mother, working with her women's organizations, helping her to train them, to teach them reading and writing, teaching them nutrition. So it's been a long journey. My story has a long journey, which I started when I was a young girl. My mother really was my inspiration. My mother worked for women literally the whole of her life and introduced me to working with women. When I was a student, I would go from Gayaza High School on holiday, and she would have a group of women lined up for me to teach them how to read, how to write, how to feed children, because at Gayaza we had a nutrition program. And so I would take it home with me. And literally the work I do today is because of my mother, because I wanted to do the exact work that I saw her doing, because I saw it making a difference in girls' and women's lives.
My experience in the UK as a black woman from Africa was a very interesting one. At the time that I was there, at the time that I was going through my degree and so on, there was a huge influx of refugees from Africa. And at the time in Uganda, the refugee influx, obviously from the conflict, was also complicated by the HIV pandemic. And so at that time in the UK, I also became involved in a small organization called Akina Mama wa Africa that was working for migrant women in the UK. Now, there were two things I became very much aware of. The issue around race and also the issue around our being women, the issue around gender. It made no difference in the UK that I had a decent education in East Africa, for example, or that my mother was from what was regarded as a fairly well-off family here. My mother went to the UK after my father died. So we started at rock bottom. And at that time, we were at the bottom of the pile. The fact that, as Black women and as African women, often we didn't speak the language. The fact that, your refugee status or your status as a Black woman was tied to your husband, so you couldn't necessarily leave your husband because that meant that you couldn't then stay in the UK, you would have to leave. I was also very conscious of the fact that there was a women's movement in the UK, but it was largely dominated by white middle-class women who were speaking on behalf of African women. These women used to come, very well intended, used to come to Africa and do 2 weeks field visits and then would come back to the UK as experts. So Akina Mama established itself by African women, for African women, and the political stance there was that we are going to speak for ourselves on issues that are, of importance to us.
Okay, so these are some of my, feminist Bible books. Obviously, this, really important. There are a couple of others. I reread this book so many times. Audre Lorde. This is also a really good one. Bell Hooks. Yeah. Anyway, there's a couple of them on this shelf that I really like. I think I came to my feminism initially not through reading books, right? One, the ways in which my parents raised my brother and I is that it was very liberal, it was very non-traditional. There were no gender roles in our house. But I was also very aware that that dynamic did not exist outside our home, because even when we would go even to school, I could see that those very gender roles playing out. Even when we went to visit, I could see that it was always the women running up and down while the men were doing nothing. And so I began to be very curious at such a young age about why that was. And in many ways, I began to resist that because my parents allowed us to do so, right? And then, I don't remember when it was, but one of the complete shifts for me was learning about Sylvia Tamale. And I actually learned about Sylvia Tamale because someone mentioned her name as a warning to me. And so the person said, if you're not careful, you end up like those people like Sylvia. And so I was curious, I was like, who is this woman, right? And so then I did my research, and I read that she was a professor of law and she was teaching, and I so badly wanted to be a lawyer at that time. And so then I began to do a little bit of digging. Another fundamental shift that happened was when I met, at that time we were termed, I think it was Twitter Mafia, feminist mafia or something, my feminist community on Twitter, right? Because then I stopped feeling so alone. And then we began to build a community of people who thought alike and began to do a lot of our activist work. We were really, really young at the time, actually, about like 21, 20 years old on Twitter. And then I went to law school and I sat in Sylvia's classes, and she introduced the concept of decolonizing and questioning things that I had never really questioned, right? Along the way, I read books. I was reading a lot of Audre Lorde, and Bell Hooks. I was really reading African American feminists. And then I began to know that even African women were writing and resisting, right? One of my absolute favorite books is Sylvia Tamale's When the Hens Crow. That's a really amazing book. Right now, my favorite book to read of hers is, which is honestly like my Bible, her Afrofeminism and decolonization book. I recommend that because that has even further cemented me in understanding why African feminism must be distinguished from any type of feminism, because ours is rooted in the understanding that coloniality is a problem. And so as we begin to deconstruct, we must also understand the ways in which all our oppressions intersect.
1930, yes, 1933, but this must have been taken maybe 1935 or so. Women's rights come because it's a tradition of many years in many countries all over. I remember I went to Canada for a summit conference where I went with some women here, Betty Bigombe, Getu Njuva, 3 others. We went to a summit conference in 1991. And it's there I learned women here had already started, and women could vote here since 1962. And there were some women who were in the Legislative Council who fought hard that when we come to get independence and elections, women should vote. Because it has been known that in many other countries, women had not voted. It is there I remember, was it Austria? I think it was Austria, or a country, 1 or 2 countries in Europe, where in 1991, women are not voting. So I brought that example to show you that it has been a tradition for ages and ages and ages that women were to come slowly, to be raised up slowly, to come later. So the women had to get together. Somehow I wasn't born. When we came to get together in 1914, somehow they found they wanted to come together to work together in order to raise themselves up, to raise their families, as Mothers Union started. And gradually, this was picked up. They were just saw it fit. As they became more educated and more civilized and more Christian, I thought it was necessary to come together and then see how we can improve society and ourselves.
I first realized that men and women in Uganda live life differently as a child. I'm a child of very strong women, women who were very fiercely independent, and women who, from a very early age, worked to sort of bring other women up. My grandmother, her friends were all very early pioneers of the women's movement in Uganda. So I was born into it, actually.